The back door of Whitmore & Co. swung open, and Jolene Marsh hit the alley like a bag of trash tossed into a rainy night. Both knees struck wet concrete. The leather-bound notebook, the only thing her grandmother ever left her, flew from her hands, skidded across dirty water, and came to rest in a puddle. Behind her, 4 or 5 kitchen staffers crowded the doorstep, laughing. The kind of laughter men produce when they believe they are standing on the safe side of the joke. Mr. Whitmore made it clear, the restaurant manager said, arms folded in the doorway. This isn't the right fit. Jolene sat in the middle of the alley, her dress soaked through, both palms pressed flat against the ground. She did not scream. She did not cry. She breathed. One slow, deliberate breath, the way a person breathes when they have survived worse and know it. Nobody stepped off that doorstep. Then the laughter stopped. Not gradually, all at once, like a light killed at the breaker. A black car pulled up at the mouth of the alley. The door opened. Footsteps on wet ground. Unhurried. A shadow stretched long across the concrete and fell over Jolene. The manager on the doorstep recognized him first, mouth half open, face draining. One of the staffers whispered loud enough for the whole alley to hear. Kincaid. All 4 disappeared inside. The door slammed shut. Wade Kincaid did not look after them. He looked at Jolene. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Get up," he said, his voice low and level. "This alley is no place for you. Stay until the end of this story, because what happens after that rainy night will change both of these people, and an entire city with them. If this story moved you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel because every next story is worth staying for." Wade took her to a modest diner 2 streets away. The place was small, lit by yellow lamps, the kind of place where nobody asked anyone else's name. He ordered 2 portions and set one in front of her. Jolene ate. She ate like someone who hadn't had a decent meal in 3 days, and that was exactly true. But no one at that table said a word about it. Wade ate slowly, glancing toward the glass door from time to time, in the manner of a man used to watching every entrance and every exit in any room he walked into. When they finished eating, Jolene set her fork down, took the coat from her shoulders, folded it neatly, and pushed it toward Wade. "Thank you. I'm giving it back." Wade looked at the coat. "Keep it. I have plenty." Jolene shook her head. "I don't take things from strangers, especially expensive things." She placed the coat on the chair, held the leather-bound notebook, still damp, tightly against her chest, then stood up. "I'll accept the meal, because I was hungry, but I don't need pity." Wade said nothing. He stayed seated, watching her walk to the door and step into the rainy night for the second time that evening. Her back straight, her steps steady, as though the alley behind Whitmore Restaurant had never happened at all. The diner door closed. Wade took a sip of the coffee left in his cup and looked at the coat lying on the empty chair. He wasn't used to being refused, and he wasn't used to remembering a stranger's face for that long. 3 days after that rainy night, Jolene Marsh knocked on 7 different doors in South Beach. 7 places, 7 refusals. No one said the reason plainly. They only said, "It's already been leased," or "It isn't a good fit," or "Try another neighborhood." But Jolene understood. She had grown up in a world where rejection rarely wore its true face. In South Beach, every new food business had to have approval from Whitmore & Co. It wasn't law. No one had written it down on paper, but it operated exactly like law, and everyone who had been here long enough knew it. Perry Whitmore wasn't targeting Jolene personally. He didn't need to. His system automatically crushed anyone who tried to open a door without permission, and Jolene was only one of them. On the evening of the 3rd day, she sat on the steps of a closed shop across from Perry's main restaurant, looking at the long street ahead of her. Yellow streetlights, empty sidewalks, music from some distant bar drifting over, then fading away. She didn't cry. She was calculating her next move. Jolene Marsh always had a next move, even when she didn't yet know what that move was. At that exact moment, a familiar black car pulled up in front of Whitmore & Co. The car door opened. Wade Kincaid stepped out and walked through the main entrance. He didn't look across at her. He didn't know she was there. He had come to finish the business meeting that had been interrupted 3 nights earlier, the night he had seen her in the alley. Perry Whitmore leased space on land Wade controlled, and there were numbers to settle, terms to sign. That was why he was here. It had nothing to do with the woman sitting on the steps across the street. 20 minutes later, Wade stepped out through the main entrance, his suit jacket over his shoulder, and walked toward the car. Then he stopped. He looked across the street and saw Jolene sitting on the steps of the closed shop, her back against the wooden doorframe, the leather-bound notebook resting on her lap. He recognized her immediately. Not many people got thrown out of a 5-star restaurant and stood back up with their spine that straight. He stood still for a moment, then crossed the street and sat down on the step beside her without asking permission. Jolene wasn't surprised. She looked at him the way she looked at the weather, as something happening around her that she couldn't control, but didn't intend to run from either. "You're still here?" Wade asked. "I'm still in Miami," Jolene said. "Those are two different things." Wade looked at the notebook on her lap. The old leather cover, the frayed edges, the rain stains that had dried but still spread in faint patches across the surface. "What can you cook?" Jolene closed the notebook and looked straight into his eyes. "Everything in this book. 3 generations of women in my family wrote these recipes. And I cook better than any restaurant you've ever walked into, including the one you just came out of." Wade didn't laugh. He didn't nod. He gave no reaction that could be read on his face. He looked at her, and in that pocket of silence, he assessed her. Not her appearance, not her circumstances. He assessed how much truth was in what she had said, and he decided she was telling the truth, because liars didn't look straight at people like that, and liars didn't sit for 3 nights on the steps across from the man who had thrown them into an alley. "I have a place," he said. "No one would dare keep you from leasing it." He took out his phone and made a call. 4 words. "Warehouse, Pier 7. Clear it." Then he hung up. No explanation. No asking anyone's opinion. 2 hours later, the two of them stood in front of a warehouse near the harbor. The iron door had already been opened. Inside, it was empty. Cleaner than an abandoned warehouse should have been, as though whatever had once been there had been removed very quickly and very thoroughly by people who knew how not to leave traces behind. Jolene stepped inside and looked around. 4 concrete walls, a high ceiling, a stained floor, the smell of dampness and sea salt. "What was stored here before?" she asked. "Nothing you need to know," Wade said, his voice flat, offering no invitation for another question. Jolene didn't ask again. She walked slowly along the wall, her hand touching the rough concrete surface, her eyes measuring the distance from wall to wall, from floor to ceiling, from the door to the corner, where afternoon light slipped through a crack. She didn't see an abandoned warehouse. She saw where the stove would go, where the counter would stand, where long benches could be set for customers waiting for hot pastries. She saw a kitchen. The next morning, Jolene arrived at the warehouse at 6 o'clock, carrying a long list of things that needed to be done and a patience she had forged through years of standing in a kitchen alone. Wade arrived at 7 o'clock, dressed in a black suit as always, looking like a man who had just stepped out of a board meeting, not someone who had come to clean out a warehouse. Jolene looked at the suit, looked at the concrete floor covered in dust as thick as a finger joint, then looked back at Wade. "You're planning to sweep the floor in that?" Wade took off his suit jacket, draped it over the window frame, and rolled up his shirt sleeves. "How about now?" Jolene handed him the broom. Within the first 15 minutes, Jolene confirmed something she had already suspected. Wade Kincaid, the man all of Miami didn't dare say by name too loudly, had never held a broom in his life. He swept at a strange angle. The broom handle pointed outward like a spear, and the dust didn't move toward the door. It circled around his feet, then drifted right back to where it had started. He looked as though he was arguing with the floor, and the floor was winning. Jolene stood in the opposite corner, wiping down a shelf, watching without saying a word. She let him struggle on his own for 20 minutes, not out of cruelty, but because she wanted to see whether he would quit. He didn't quit. He swept completely wrong, but he swept with stubborn patience, and Jolene took note of that. "Mr. Kincaid," she finally said, her voice as calm as if she were reading a cake recipe. "You're pushing dust from one corner to another. That's a different sport." Wade stopped, looked at the broom, then looked at the pile of dust still sitting in its original place, only slightly altered in shape. He adjusted his grip, lowered the angle, and tried again. The result improved a little. The dust began moving in the right direction, though slowly and reluctantly. Jolene gave one firm nod, like a general accepting that a new recruit had at least learned which end of the rifle to hold. "Better," she said, then turned back to wiping the shelf. And Wade didn't know why those 2 words made him want to sweep the entire room clean. They worked all day. Jolene gave orders, and Wade followed them. Not because he was used to taking orders, but because inside this warehouse, she knew what she was doing, and he didn't, and Wade was smart enough to recognize that. She showed him how to scrape old residue from the walls, how to mop the floor without leaving streaks, how to arrange the space so the light from the cracks in the door would fall exactly where it needed to fall. He worked slowly, but he didn't complain, and she didn't praise him, but she also didn't criticize him further. Between them, a strange rhythm began to form, the kind shared by two people who didn't yet know each other, but had already learned how not to collide in the same room. That evening, when the last sunlight slipped through the cracks in the wall and drew long golden lines across the freshly cleaned concrete floor, the two of them stood in the middle of the room. The smell of dampness had given way to the scent of soap and the sea wind blowing in from the harbor. Jolene placed her hand on the concrete wall, feeling the rough surface beneath her palm. "It'll hold," she said, and she wasn't only talking about the wall. Wade looked around the room, at the lines of sunlight across the floor, at the broom propped in the corner, the same broom he had used all day. "I believe it will," he said, and he wasn't only talking about the wall either. The stove arrived on Thursday. The two movers set it down in the middle of the warehouse and left, and Jolene stood there looking at it the way someone looks at an old friend finally found again after many years. She spent the entire afternoon cleaning it, checking every burner, every joint, adjusting the oven temperature until she could feel its rhythm beneath her palm. Then she went to sleep and set her alarm for 3:30 in the morning, because Jolene Marsh was the kind of person who believed a new day began when dough met fire, not when the sun came up. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she lit the stove. The clatter of aluminum trays, the snap of a lighter, the sound of butter melting on a hot pan drifted out through the half-open warehouse door and slipped into the street, still sleeping in the dark. Bert Henley was awakened by that sound. He was lying on the stone bench across from the warehouse, the same stone bench he had treated as his bed for the past several months, ever since the last rented room he had was no longer his. Bert was 62 years old. He had once played trumpet in jazz clubs people lined up to get into. He had once worn a white suit and stood on stage under blue lights. He had once been somebody. Now he was a man who had lost his direction for so long he had forgotten he ever had one. The clatter from the warehouse irritated him. He was about to stand up, roll up his blanket, and look for another stone bench somewhere quieter. Then the smell spread out. He didn't follow the smell. The smell came to him. It threaded through the damp morning air, across the street, over the dry grass, all the way to the stone bench where he sat, and settled over him like a blanket warmer than any blanket he owned. Hot butter, lightly burned sugar, cinnamon, and something deeper he couldn't name, but his body recognized before his mind did. He remembered, 20 years earlier, the jazz club where he used to play trumpet had a small kitchen in the back, and the woman in that kitchen used to bake before opening time. It had smelled exactly like this. He sat still on the stone bench, breathing it in, and for the first time in a very long while, he wanted to go somewhere specific. He stood up. Not because he was hungry, because he was curious, because that smell reminded him that somewhere inside that worn old warehouse, someone was awake at 4 o'clock in the morning caring about the work in front of her, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be near a person like that. He crossed the street and walked to the warehouse door. Yellow light spilled out from inside. Jolene stood behind the stove, her hands kneading dough, her apron tied tight, sweat beading across her forehead even though the air was still cool. She looked up and saw an old man standing in the doorway, his clothes wrinkled, his knit cap pulled low, his body thin in the way of someone who had stopped eating proper meals a long time ago. "Do you want to eat, or do you want to stand there?" she asked, her voice neither cold nor warm, only direct, the voice of a woman who didn't have time for ceremony, but did have time for a meal. Bert stepped inside and sat down on the only long bench Jolene had set up. His knit cap came off automatically and settled on his lap, like an old habit from the days when he still knew how to behave at a table. Jolene placed a cinnamon pastry fresh from the oven in front of him and poured coffee into a paper cup. He held the pastry with both hands, gripping it tightly, as if afraid it would disappear if his hold loosened. Then he ate, slowly, his eyes closed, not because he was savoring it, but because he didn't want to see anything except the taste of that pastry melting on his tongue, the first warm sweetness he had tasted that didn't ask him to pay for it with his sobriety. When he finished eating, Bert set the cup down, stood up, put his cap back on, and left. He didn't say a word. No thank you, no promise to come back, nothing at all. The warehouse door closed behind him, and Jolene stood there looking at the empty bench, the clean plate, the drained coffee cup. She thought he wouldn't come back. People like him were used to receiving something and then disappearing, and she didn't blame them, because she understood that sometimes disappearing was the only way they knew to avoid owing anyone. But the next morning, when Jolene opened the warehouse door at 4:15, Bert was already standing outside. His knit cap was on his head, his arms folded across his chest, and he said nothing. He only stood there, as if this was his place, and he had never stood anywhere else. Jolene looked at him. He looked at her. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. Bert came in and sat in the same place. From then on, every morning, 2 weeks later, Marsh's was no longer a warehouse. Bert Henley didn't call out to anyone, didn't invite anyone, didn't tell a single person that there was a place worth going to at Pier 7. He only came back every morning, sat in the same spot, ate in the same spot, and people began to notice. An old man everyone in South Beach knew by sight, a man who had slept on a stone bench for so many months, suddenly walked in one specific direction every morning, with purpose in his steps. People grew curious. A week later, 3 more people followed him there. The next week, there were 6, then 15. The long bench inside Marsh's became 2 rows of benches. The pot of coffee Jolene brewed never had time to cool before someone poured from it, and the scent of cinnamon pastries at 4 o'clock in the morning became something the entire harbor district had grown so used to that they no longer noticed it. It was simply there, like the sea wind. One morning, Jolene opened the door and saw a wooden sign hanging above the frame, hand-painted, the letters bold, Marsh's. Wade had hired someone to paint it without telling her first. Jolene stood, looking at the sign, tilted her head, then said to Wade, who was sitting in the inside corner drinking coffee, "When did you do this?" Wade took a sip of coffee. "Yesterday." Jolene looked back at the sign and gave one nod, the way a person pretends to be surprised and knows the other person knows she's pretending, and both of them accept it. That same week, Wade sat in the conference room of Kincaid Holdings on the 23rd floor, looking down at the Miami skyline. 3 men sat across from him, the kind of men who wore suits but whose eyes never smiled at the same time as their mouths. They wanted to buy the entire harbor district, tear it down, and build a chain of nightclubs. Pier 7 was part of it. Marsh's was part of it. "That area has potential," the man in the middle said, his voice as smooth as a polished tabletop. "The girl running a bakery at the harbor. Clear it out, rebuild, and the profit goes up tenfold." Wade held his glass of whiskey and turned it slowly in his hand. The light passed through the amber liquor and cast a small streak of brightness across the oak table. The whole room went quiet, because when Wade Kincaid turned a glass without drinking, it meant he was considering something. And when he was considering something, no one should speak further. "That area isn't for sale," he said. The man in the middle leaned forward. "Wade, that's money. A great deal of money." Wade set the glass down on the table, softly, but the sound of glass touching oak rang through the silent conference room like a hammer striking an anvil, the kind of small sound everyone heard clearly because no one dared breathe too loudly. "I said that area isn't for sale. You heard me. Don't make me say it a 3rd time." No one said what a 3rd time meant. No one needed to ask. The 3 men stood, buttoned their suit jackets, and headed for the door. The man in the middle stopped in the doorway, turned back to look at Wade, seemed about to say something more, then looked into his eyes and decided not to. The door closed. Wade remained alone in the wide conference room, took a sip of whiskey, and looked down at the skyline where the harbor appeared small in the distance, where there was an old warehouse and a woman baking for people no one else bothered to see. That afternoon, Wade came to Marsh's. He sat in his usual corner, and Jolene set coffee in front of him without asking, because she already knew what he drank. But today, she didn't turn away right away. She stayed there, looked at his face, and tilted her head slightly to one side. "Who wants to take this place?" she asked, her voice level. Wade looked up. "How do you know?" "Because you have the face of a man who just said no to someone used to hearing yes." Wade looked at her, and once again he realized that Jolene Marsh wasn't someone who could be fooled. She didn't know the details, didn't know the conference room, didn't know the 3 men in suits, but she could read people, and she could read him, and that unsettled him and relieved him at the same time. The kind of relief that comes when a person doesn't have to keep any mask in place before someone who has already seen through it. "Is this place still mine?" Jolene asked. "This place is yours." Jolene nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. Then I still have pastries to bake. Perry Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who counted money every day. He had people for that. But when the numbers began dropping for 3 consecutive weeks, when the tables in the main dining room of Whitmore & Co. started sitting empty during Saturday lunch, when the manager reported that regular customers were shifting to someplace down by the harbor, Perry Whitmore began to care. He didn't get angry. He wasn't the kind of man who got angry. He was the kind of man who remembered. And what he remembered was usually not good for the person being remembered. One Tuesday morning, during the busiest hour, when Marsh's was at its most crowded, Perry Whitmore walked in. He wore a pale gray suit and polished shoes, and he came alone, bringing no one with him because he didn't need anyone else to apply pressure. His presence was enough, or so he thought. He stepped through the doorway and paused for one beat so the whole place could see him, and at that exact moment, his eyes swept toward the right corner. Wade Kincaid was sitting there, a cup of coffee in front of him, his back against the wall, looking at Perry with eyes that showed no expression except the simple acknowledgement that he had seen him. Perry looked at Wade. Wade looked at Perry. Between those two men, there was a wordless conversation that lasted about 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, Perry understood that whatever he had planned to do inside this little place had a limit, and that limit was sitting in the right corner drinking coffee. Perry chose to approach the counter instead of starting trouble. He walked past the 2 long rows of benches filled with customers, moving slowly, letting everyone look, letting the air change. And the air did change. The people eating looked up, recognized him, and the noisy little place suddenly dropped by 1 notch, the way a room adjusts its own volume when someone walks in whom no one wanted to invite. Jolene stood behind the counter, holding a tray of pastries fresh from the oven. She watched Perry come to stand before her, then set the tray down, not hurried, not slow, but exactly in her own rhythm. "Miss Marsh," Perry said, his voice polite in the way of a man used to using politeness as a weapon. "I've heard a great deal about this place." "Mr. Whitmore," Jolene replied, her voice flat. "I've heard a great deal about you too." Perry placed both hands on the counter, his fingers tapping lightly. "You're disrupting the order of things. This neighborhood operates in a certain way. Everyone knows their place. You're new here, so perhaps you don't understand how things work." Jolene looked straight into his eyes. "Everyone used to know their place once. Funny, isn't it?" Perry didn't smile. His fingers stopped tapping. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came to advise you. Be careful with what you're building here. Everything in South Beach can collapse. Faster than you think." Jolene didn't blink. She had heard that voice before, not from Perry Whitmore specifically, but from men like him, the kind of men who used advice as a threat and politeness as a glove. She wasn't afraid, not because she was brave, but because she had been threatened enough times to know that fear didn't change anything. It only slowed the hands kneading the dough. She turned toward the row of customers staring at them, her voice ordinary, as if Perry Whitmore wasn't standing in front of her. "Hot pastries. Watch your hands." She handed pastries to the 2 nearest customers, then turned back, looked at Perry, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to offer you one before you leave. Cinnamon pastry, fresh from the oven. I think you'll like it." Perry looked at the pastry on the counter, looked at Jolene, and decided that accepting anything from this woman's hand would mean admitting she had something worth giving. He turned around, walked toward the door, passed between the 2 rows of benches, and the whole place watched him in silence. When he passed the right corner, Wade lifted his coffee cup, took one slow sip, and looked at Perry with the gaze of a man drinking his morning coffee with nothing to hurry for. Perry saw it. His steps became faster, only a little faster, just enough for anyone perceptive to notice that Perry Whitmore was leaving Marsh's not entirely at the pace he wanted. The door closed. The place slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Small laughter, cups touching plates, Bert clearing his throat in his familiar seat. Jolene wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward Wade's corner. "You know him?" she asked. Wade set his cup down. "Everyone in Miami knows me. Not everyone likes that." Jolene looked at him for one more beat, then turned back to the kitchen, and the cinnamon pastry Perry Whitmore hadn't taken remained on the counter, cooling slowly, like something offered to a man who wasn't large enough to hold it. After the day Perry Whitmore came and left, Wade began sitting in the corner of the shop every day. No one told him to be a bodyguard. No one paid him. No one gave a name to what he was doing. He simply came, sat in the same place, drank coffee, and watched the door. His presence was enough. Men with bad intentions looked into the shop, saw Wade Kincaid in the right corner, and decided that today wasn't a good day to start trouble. But not everyone was smart enough to read that signal. One noon, a customer in an expensive polo shirt, wearing a watch heavy on his wrist, the kind of man used to being served and used to thinking money allowed him to say anything he wanted, sat on the bench near the counter and called loudly over Jolene's shoulder, "Hey, fat cook, more coffee." The whole place heard it. The sound of conversation dropped by one notch. Bert lifted his head from his usual seat, his eyes narrowing. Wade, in the right corner, set his coffee cup down, but didn't stand. He looked at Jolene. Jolene didn't need anyone to stand up for her. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped out from behind the counter, and walked straight to the man's table. He watched her come, his mouth still smiling. Jolene set a cinnamon pastry in front of him, gently, precisely, then looked straight into his eyes. "Free," she said, her voice clear enough for the whole place to hear, "because I saw your mouth was empty, and that's why it was talking trash." The whole shop burst into laughter. Not loud laughter, but all at once, the kind of laughter that breaks open by itself when everyone realizes at the same time who is winning the conversation. The customer's face turned red. He looked down at the pastry, looked around at the smiling faces, and realized that every exit led through the pastry in front of him. He ate. He went quiet. He paid and left without looking back. Wade sat in the corner, his coffee cup in front of him, watching Jolene return to the counter with the calm stride of a woman who had merely served another tray of pastries, not taken down a grown man with one sentence and one cinnamon pastry. He realized something he hadn't thought of before. She didn't need him to protect her. She needed him there, but not because she was weak, because there were things bigger than a loud-mouthed customer that one person shouldn't have to face alone. The small things she could handle, and she handled them better than he did. That afternoon, Jolene carried a tray of pastries past Wade, on her way to the outside table. As she passed, powdered sugar from the pastries drifted lightly into the air and settled on the shoulder of Wade's black suit jacket, white against the dark fabric. Jolene looked at the powder, then stopped. "You've lost your edge," she said. Wade looked down at his shoulder, at the white powder on the black cloth. Then he looked around the shop, at Bert in his usual seat drinking coffee, at the two elderly women on the outer bench sharing a peach pastry, at the afternoon sunlight pouring through the glass door onto faces that had become familiar. "No," he said, "I haven't lost anything." He turned back toward the door, watching over the shop, the powdered sugar still white on the shoulder of his suit jacket. No one minded. One morning, Wade didn't come. For the first time since Marsh's opened, the right corner was empty. No one ordered the usual cup of coffee, and Jolene realized she had grown more used to his presence than she had thought. She didn't ask why he was absent, because she understood that Wade Kincaid's world had appointments she shouldn't know about and didn't want to know about. She baked, served customers, Bert sat in his familiar seat, and everything moved as usual. Then the door opened, and a man Jolene had never seen before walked in. He didn't introduce himself. He sat down on the bench near the counter, ordered black coffee, and began looking around the place with the eyes of a man measuring it, the kind of man who entered a house not to live in it, but to put a price on it. Jolene set the coffee in front of him, and in that moment, when their eyes met, she read something in this man she didn't like. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't the kind of contempt the rich customer had shown the other day. What she read was calculation, the cold kind, hidden behind a polite smile and a cup of coffee, ordered at just the right time. Life had taught Jolene to read people early, not through books, but through hundreds of times standing before smiling faces while their hands were clenched tight. "This place is pleasant," he said, taking a sip of coffee, his voice gentle. Wade chose well. Jolene didn't sit down. She didn't lean against the counter. She stood straight, one hand resting on the counter, keeping just enough distance between politeness and caution. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ronan. I work with Wade. 8 years now. 8 years is a long time. Long enough to know when he changes." Ronan took another sip of coffee, set the cup down, and turned it lightly on the counter. "Wade has changed a lot since he met you." Jolene looked at him, at the way he turned the cup, at the way he said "changed," in the voice of a man weighing something on a scale and finding it lighter than expected. You say that like it's a bad thing, she replied. Ronan looked up, the smile still there, but his eyes weren't smiling. In our line of work, change is an opening. People look for openings to exploit. That's how things operate. I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying it because I've followed Wade for 8 years, and I don't want to see him make a mistake. Jolene looked straight into Ronan's eyes, the way she looked at anyone trying to play the good man while hiding a hand behind his back. In my line of work, she said, her voice slow and clear, each word placed down like a knife on a cutting board. Not changing means the dough doesn't rise. And if the dough doesn't rise, you throw it out. Ronan looked at her for one more beat. Then he gave a small laugh. The kind of laugh that came from a man who had just received an answer smarter than he expected, and didn't know whether to be pleased or worried. He stood, left money for the coffee on the counter, nodded goodbye, then walked out the door. He didn't look back. The door closed. Jolene stood behind the counter, her hand gripping the wooden edge, her knuckles white. The shop was still noisy around her. Bert was still sitting in his familiar seat. Sunlight was still pouring through the glass door, but Jolene felt that something in the air had just changed, something she couldn't name. She only knew that her stomach tightened the way it always did when something was about to happen. That evening, Wade came to Marsh's late, after closing time. Jolene was wiping down the counter. The shop was empty, with only the yellow light from the kitchen spilling across the tile floor. Wade sat down in his usual chair. Jolene set coffee in front of him, then stayed standing there. Someone came by today, she said. Name was Ronan. Wade looked up before taking a drink. Ronan came here, had coffee, talked, left. Very polite. Jolene wiped her hands on a towel and looked straight at Wade. This Ronan of yours, how much do you trust him? 100%, Wade said, without hesitation, without thought, like a man answering a question whose answer had been certain for 8 years. Jolene went quiet. She didn't say more, because she had no proof, only instinct, and instinct couldn't be placed on the table. But she remembered the way Ronan had turned the coffee cup, remembered the eyes that didn't smile at the same time as his mouth, remembered the way he had said opening in the voice of a man searching for a door, not warning someone about one. Jolene Marsh had never trusted the wrong person, and she hoped this would be the first time. The last customer left at 9 o'clock at night. Bert was the last one, as always. He stood up, put on his cap, nodded to Jolene, then walked out the door toward the stone bench across the street. The door closed. The shop was empty. The noise pulled away like the tide, leaving behind silence and the smell of old coffee clinging to the walls. Jolene didn't leave right away. She sat behind the counter, opened the leather-bound notebook, and turned to the pages where the ink had blurred from that rainy night in the alley behind Whitmore Restaurant. The rainwater had dried long ago, but her grandmother's handwriting, in many places, was now only a faded smear, broken words, recipes missing half a line, her mother's notes in the margins, turned into unreadable brown stains. She took out a pen, a small notebook, and began writing it all again, line by line, word by word, from memory. She didn't need to look at the original, because the original had faded, but she remembered. She remembered everything, and her hand moved steadily, like someone copying down something already carved deep inside her. Wade stacked the chairs. He lifted each one, turned it upside down on the table, steady and unhurried. The sound of chairs touching wood made an even rhythm in the empty shop, woven through with the sound of Jolene's pen moving across paper. He had stacked 4 chairs when he stopped and looked toward the counter, watching her bent over under the yellow light as she wrote. "You remember all of it?" he asked. Jolene didn't look up. Her hand kept writing. Every word. My grandmother made me read it every night before bed, like a prayer. Every night, from the time I was 7 years old until the day she died. I think she knew there would come a day when the notebook would be ruined, lost, soaked. So she put it in my head first. She didn't trust paper. She trusted memory. Wade watched her write a few more lines, her handwriting even, without hesitation, like someone listening to another person dictate. "Your grandmother taught you how to cook?" he asked. Jolene stopped writing and looked up. "She taught me that cooking is the only thing I can give away that no one can ever give back." She set the pen down, looked at Wade, and for the first time in all the evenings they had spent together in the empty shop, she spoke more than 3 sentences in a row. "People can laugh at me, throw me into an alley, look down on me because of how I look, because of how much I weigh. because I don't match what they think a person in a kitchen should look like. But no one can erase the meal that fed them when they needed it. No one can return the taste of a pastry that made them remember something they had forgotten. My mother was plus-size too. So was my grandmother. 3 generations of women, and every place we ever lived had some Perry Whitmore in it. Someone who thought he had the right to decide who got to stay and who had to leave. And every time, my family's answer was the same: cook, because that is the one thing no one can take away. The shop was silent. The air conditioner hummed softly in the corner. The kitchen light cast a yellow glow over Jolene's face, over the open notebook, over the lines she had just written back into being from the memory of 3 generations. Wade stood in the middle of the shop, his hand still resting on the back of a chair he hadn't turned over yet, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had just heard something he hadn't known he needed to hear until it was spoken. He didn't answer right away. He finished stacking the chair in his hand, turned it upside down on the table, then walked slowly toward the counter and sat down on the chair across from Jolene. He looked down at his wrist, where the old watch lay, its glass slightly scratched, its leather strap worn, the second hand still moving steadily. "My father built everything I have," he said, his voice lower than usual, the voice of a man unused to speaking about this, and forced to search for each word in a place he usually kept locked. He was the one who built it all. The empire, the network, the Kincaid name. He was also the cruelest man I ever knew. He stopped. His finger touched the watch face, turning it slightly. "I don't wear this watch because I miss him. I wear it because every time I look at it, I remember not to become him." Jolene looked at him, looked at the watch, looked at his finger moving over the scratched glass. Then she asked, her voice soft but direct, the way a person asks because she truly wants to know, not because she is being polite. "Then who are you becoming?" Wade didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, because he didn't know yet. That question settled between them like something heavy that neither of them lifted, neither of them put away, just left there on the wooden counter between the recipe notebook and the cold cup of coffee, and both of them knew it would stay there until Wade found the answer. Jolene didn't push. She gave a small nod, not agreement, not disappointment, only an acknowledgement that silence was sometimes the most honest answer. She picked up the pen, turned back to the notebook, and began writing again. Her handwriting steady once more. Her grandmother reading, Jolene copying, as she had every night when she was little. Wade sat across from her. He didn't stack any more chairs. He didn't drink any more coffee. He only sat there, in the empty shop, beneath the yellow light, watching a woman write recipes back from memory, and listening to the sound of the pen against paper. And the silence between them wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was already full of what had just been said, full of what didn't need to be said, full of old coffee and yellow light, and the sound of pen on paper inside the little place both of them had built from an abandoned warehouse and 4 concrete walls. And if anyone had asked Jolene then how much she trusted Wade Kincaid, she wouldn't have said 100%, because she had heard someone say 100% before, and she knew that number was sometimes only a way to avoid looking closely. She would have said, enough to sit here, enough to write the notebook while he stacked chairs, enough to ask him who he was becoming without being afraid of the answer. Ronan didn't make his move out of hatred. He made it out of calculation. 8 years following Wade Kincaid, 8 years standing behind him, knowing every route, every move, every number, every name, and in those 8 years, Ronan had never seen Wade make a mistake. Not until a little bakery appeared at the harbor, and his boss started sitting there drinking coffee with powdered sugar on the shoulder of his suit jacket. Ronan saw what he called an opening, and in the world they both lived in, an opening was opportunity. And opportunity only came once. Ronan contacted a gang in New York, men who had wanted to expand into Miami for a long time, but had never dared, because the Kincaid name stood across their path like a wall. Ronan sold them the one thing no one else had: information. Wade's schedule, the times when he was alone at the shop, the times when he didn't bring his men, the places he went without warning anyone, and most important of all, his weakness. Wade Kincaid had a weakness for the first time in 14 years, and that weakness was at Pier 7, kneading dough at 4 o'clock in the morning. Ronan didn't sell that information because he hated Wade. He sold it because this world had no room for loyalty when loyalty was no longer paid what it was worth. At least, that was what Ronan thought. The meeting was carefully staged. Ronan called Wade one afternoon, his voice normal, saying there were new partners from New York who wanted to meet. At the harbor, 9 o'clock at night, just to talk. Wade didn't suspect him. 100%, he had said, and 100% left no room for questions. Wade arrived at the harbor exactly at 9 o'clock, bringing one bodyguard with him. The harbor at night was silent, with only the sound of water striking the wooden pilings and the yellow light from a few scattered street lamps. The car stopped. Wade stepped out. The bodyguard stepped out behind him. The two men walked along the pier, their footsteps sounding against the wooden planks. The bodyguard stopped. "I'll check the car for a moment," he said, then turned away and walked back toward the parking lot. Wade watched him go. His stomach tightened, the kind of tightening that 14 years in the business had taught him never to ignore. His bodyguard never left without permission. Never. Wade turned his head forward, and he knew. He knew before he saw anything. He knew from that tightening in his gut, from the sound of the bodyguard's footsteps fading too quickly, from the thick silence covering the pier, the kind of silence no ordinary meeting ever had. He knew, and he knew too late. 5 men stepped out of the darkness at the far end of the pier. They said nothing. They didn't need to. They had come to do one thing, and that thing needed no opening words. Wade stood alone in the middle of the pier, the sea wind blowing hard, yellow light falling across the 5 shadows moving toward him. Wade Kincaid didn't run. In 14 years, he had never run, and he wasn't going to start tonight. He turned, lowered his center of gravity, and when the first man lunged, Wade dropped him onto the wooden planks with a move he had used all his life. The second man came into range. Wade turned, and took him down too. The third was slower, hesitant, and that hesitation gave Wade enough time to put him on the boards beside the other 2. 3 men were down. Wade was standing above them, breathing hard. And in that moment, he was still Wade Kincaid, the man all Miami feared, the man no one could bring down. Then the other 2 attacked from behind. Wade didn't see them. He only felt the force slam into his back, into his ribs, and his knees hit the wooden planks before he could turn. He fell. The pier shook beneath his weight. He tried to push himself up. One hand braced against the floor, but another blow to the ribs kept him down. He caught one man by the ankle, pulled, and the man fell with him, panicked, yanked his leg free, and backed away. Even lying on the wooden planks, Wade Kincaid still made people want to stay farther away, rather than come closer. One man bent down, grabbed Wade's wrist, and tore off the watch. The leather strap snapped. The man held the watch up, looked at it, then threw it over the railing of the pier. A small splash, the water swallowing it, then nothing. "Kincaid is finished," the man said, and all 5 of them left quickly, their hurried footsteps striking the wooden planks, because even after winning, no one wanted to stay near Wade Kincaid any longer than necessary. Wade lay on the pier. Rain began to fall, soft, the kind of late-night Miami rain that came quietly. His ribs hurt, his face was bruised, his shirt was torn, and his wrist was empty, light in a way he had never felt in the 14 years he had worn that watch. He lay there, alone on the wet pier, and for the first time in his life, he realized that no one was coming. No one knew he was here. He had always been the person others called when they needed help, or when they needed something to fear, but no one called to ask if he was all right, because everyone always assumed Wade Kincaid was always fine. He lay there for 1 minute, 2 minutes, then he rolled onto his side, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. The screen cracked but still glowing. He scrolled through his contacts, past the names of people who worked for him, people who feared him, people who owed him, and he didn't stop on any of those names, because he didn't know who on that list was still his and who had already become Ronan's. He scrolled to a name he hadn't saved long ago, a name that didn't belong to his world. Jolene Marsh. He tapped call. The phone rang. Jolene answered, her voice thick with sleep, and Wade said only 2 words. The name of the pier. Then the call cut off, because his ribs hurt too much for him to say more, and because those 2 words were enough. Jolene didn't ask why. She heard 2 words over the phone. Pier 7. Then the line went dead, and she was already dressed, car keys in hand, out the door before her mind had time to catch up with her hands. She drove the old car through the Miami streets at 3 o'clock in the morning, the roads empty, the traffic lights blinking yellow, and for the whole distance from Marsh's to the harbor, she thought of nothing except the 2 words Wade had said and the way he had said them. His voice lower than usual, shorter than usual, the voice of a man using every bit of strength he had left to say only what was necessary. She parked at the head of the harbor, stepped out, the smell of salt and motor oil in the air. Lonely yellow lights scattered along the long pier. She saw him before he saw her. Wade was sitting with his back against a wooden post at the end of the pier, his legs stretched out in front of him, one hand holding his right side, the other hanging loose against the wet planks. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his black suit jacket was streaked with dust and water, and a purple bruise spread from his left cheekbone up toward his temple. The rain had stopped, but he was soaked through, and under the yellow light, he looked smaller than usual. Small in a way Jolene had never thought could be used to describe Wade Kincaid. She walked along the pier, her steps even against the wooden planks, not running, not rushing, because she knew that running toward a man like Wade at a moment like this would only make him feel like a burden, and he didn't need another burden. She reached him and looked down. He raised his head, his eyes narrowing slightly from pain, then recognized her. "Can you stand?" Jolene asked, her voice flat, practical, without pity, without panic. Exactly the voice Wade needed to hear right now. "My car is at the head of the pier." Wade nodded, braced his hand against the planks, and tried to stand. His ribs protested, and Jolene saw the way he clenched his teeth without making a sound. She stepped closer, slipped her shoulder under his arm, and took part of his weight. He was heavier than she had expected, or she was lighter than he needed, but the two of them still managed to move, slowly, step by step, down the pier toward the car. Neither of them said anything on that walk. The sound of their footsteps on wet wood and Wade's heavy breathing were enough. She drove back to Marsh's. The shop was dark. She opened the back door, led him inside, and turned on the kitchen lights. The familiar yellow glow spread over everything. The wooden counter, the ingredient shelves, the long benches turned upside down, and Wade sat down in the only chair still facing the right way, the chair Bert sat in every morning, and he sat there hunched over, his hand still holding his ribs, looking like another version of the man who had refused 3 partners in a conference room with a glass of whiskey and 2 sentences. Jolene didn't ask who had done it. She didn't ask why. She took a clean towel, dipped it in warm water, wrung it out, then came to sit across from him. She lifted her hand slowly, letting him see her hand coming before it touched his face, because she understood that a man who had just been attacked didn't need another surprise. She cleaned the bruise on his cheekbone, gently, the warm towel against cold skin, and Wade sat still. He sat still and let her clean his face. Wade Kincaid, the man all Miami feared, the man no one dared approach unless invited, sitting still while a woman cared for him without making him feel weak. He felt held. He didn't know that word until tonight, because no one had held him since his mother died, and he had forgotten what it felt like. But Jolene's hand on his cheekbone reminded him that being held didn't mean being weak. It meant someone thought he was worth holding. She took ice from the refrigerator, wrapped it in a cloth towel, and pressed it gently to his ribs. He hissed a breath through his teeth, but he didn't push her hand away. "Ronan," he said, his voice rough, "the person I trusted most." Jolene didn't say, "I told you." She didn't say, "I knew." She said, "Do you have any broken bones?" "Probably." "Then you eat first and figure out the rest later. An injured man shouldn't think about revenge on an empty stomach." She stood, went into the kitchen, and at 3:20 in the morning, inside the dark little shop, lit only by the kitchen lights, Jolene cooked porridge. Not a dish from the Marsh's menu, not a recipe from the leather-bound notebook. This was what her grandmother used to cook for her on difficult days, the days when she came home and didn't want to talk, the days when her grandmother only had to look at her face to know, and didn't ask, just went into the kitchen, cooked porridge, and set it in front of her. A dish that didn't need a recipe. Only rice, water, a little salt, a little ginger, and one person wanting another person to hurt less. She set the bowl of porridge in front of Wade. Steam rose into the yellow light. Wade picked up the spoon, his hand trembling slightly from pain, and he ate, slowly, spoon by spoon, without saying a word. The porridge was hot, lightly salty, ginger sharp at the back of his throat, and so simple it almost had no flavor except the care of the person who had cooked it. And that was the best taste Wade Kincaid had ever known in his life, though he didn't know how to say it. When he finished, he set the spoon down, looked at the empty bowl, then said in a low voice, "They threw my father's watch into the sea." Jolene leaned against the counter, arms folded, looking at him. She remembered the night before, The empty shop, the way he had spoken about the watch, about his father, about wearing it to remember not to become the man who had handed it down. She looked at his wrist, empty now, the faint mark where the leather strap had once been, and she said, "You said you wore it to remember not to become your father. Maybe you don't need it anymore." Wade looked at his empty wrist. He turned it slowly, feeling the weight that was no longer there. For 14 years, he had worn that watch. For 14 years, it had reminded him every time he looked down, and now it lay at the bottom of the Miami Sea, and his wrist was light, and that lightness wasn't loss. For the first time, it wasn't loss. It was something else he didn't yet know how to name. But Jolene knew, because she was looking at him with the eyes of someone who understood that sometimes having something taken from you is the only way to realize you don't need it. He said nothing more. She asked nothing more. The kitchen light stayed yellow. The empty bowl of porridge sat on the counter. And outside the window, Miami began to turn from black to gray, the kind of almost morning that hasn't fully become morning yet, the kind of in-between hour when everything is still possible. And in that in-between, Wade Kincaid sat inside a bakery with an empty wrist, an empty bowl, and a woman leaning against the counter looking at him without judgment, without fear, without pity, only looking. Perry Whitmore knew how to wait for the right moment. He didn't rush. He never rushed, because rushing was for people who didn't have enough power to wait. When word reached him that Wade Kincaid had been beaten at the harbor, through Ronan, through channels whose names he didn't need to know, Perry understood that this was the moment. Wade was weakened, Ronan had betrayed him, and the door Perry had been waiting for all these weeks had just opened. He didn't need to do anything with his own hands. He only needed to nod in the right place, pay the right person, and let everything happen in the night, when no one was watching and no one could prove a thing. That night, someone set fire to Marsh's. Jolene wasn't at the shop. She was in the small, rented room 4 blocks away, lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Wade sitting in the shop kitchen with an empty wrist and an empty bowl of porridge, thinking about Ronan and that calculating look, thinking about all the things she couldn't control, all the things she had learned long ago to live beside. She drifted off to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. Her phone was silent. No one called. No one warned her. She came to Marsh's at 4:15 in the morning, as she did every day, because 4:15 was when she lit the stove, when dough met fire, when the new day began. She turned onto the street leading to the harbor, and she smelled it before she saw it. Not the smell of pastry, the smell of ash, the smell of burned wood, the smell of melted plastic, the smell of something that had died in the night before it had a chance to cry out. She walked faster. Then she saw it. The front door of Marsh's was burned black, the wooden frame warped, the sign that said, Marsh's, the one Wade had hired someone to paint, split in two, the top half fallen to the ground, the bottom half still hanging from a bent nail. Inside, the stove had tipped sideways, the ingredient shelves had collapsed, the ceiling was smoked black, and ash covered everything like dirty snow. Water from the fire hose pooled on the floor, mixed with ash into a layer of gray mud. The long benches were burned away. The wooden counter was still standing, but its surface had blistered, the paint peeling, the wood bent out of shape. Jolene stood in the doorway and looked. Her eyes moved from left to right, measuring the damage with the instinct of someone who had built every corner of this place with her own hands. The stove was ruined. The shelves had fallen. The benches had burned. The walls were black. All of that could be rebuilt. All of it. Then her eyes stopped on the counter drawer, the place where she kept the notebook every night before she went home. She ran inside. Smoke still lingered in the air, stinging her eyes, stinging her throat. She moved through the wreckage, through ash mud, to the counter. She pulled the drawer. It was stuck, swollen from water. She yanked harder. The drawer came loose. Inside, there was ash. Only ash. Half-burned pieces of paper, their edges curled black, and in the middle, the leather cover of the notebook, shriveled, cracked, no longer holding any shape except that of a small blackened thing no one would recognize as what it had once been. Her grandmother's recipe book. 3 generations of women. Her grandmother's handwriting, careful, slanting slightly to the right. Her mother's notes in the margins, written in red pen, add a little more cinnamon, sweetheart. Jolene's own notes, in blue ink, on the pages she had tested and adjusted. All of it. Burned. Jolene stood in the middle of the ashes, holding the burned piece of leather cover in her hand, and for the first time in this whole story, through the rainy nights and filthy alleys and 7 refusals and Perry Whitmore's threats and the rich customer calling her words she didn't want to remember, for the first time, Jolene Marsh broke. Not because of the shop. The shop could be rebuilt. Not because of the stove, or the ingredient shelves, or the long benches, or the sign. Because of the notebook. Because her grandmother's handwriting wasn't something that could be rebuilt. It wasn't a recipe. It was a voice. The voice of her grandmother reading to her every night. The voice of her mother writing notes in the margins. The voices of the people she had lost and kept alive through every page of paper, and now every page was ash. Bert arrived first. He didn't say anything. He only walked through the wreckage, came to Jolene, placed a hand on her shoulder, and left it there. Trina came after him and stood beside her, one hand touching Jolene's back lightly. Then the carpenter came, the old man who often sat on the outer bench, then the laundromat owner. Then the familiar faces from every morning, the people Jolene had fed with pastries and coffee, one by one stepping through the burned black doorway and standing around her, not because they knew what to do, but because they knew where they needed to be. Jolene sat down on the burned tile floor, ash clinging to her hands, the piece of leather cover on her lap, and she cried, not loudly, not wailing. She cried like someone who had held herself together for too long, who had been strong for too long, who had breathed slowly, and stood straight, and kneaded dough, and handed out pastries, and answered Perry Whitmore without blinking. And now the only thing she couldn't replace had turned to ash in her lap, and she allowed herself not to be strong. Just once, just now. Wade came after that. His ribs still hurt, his face was still bruised, his steps still leaned slightly to one side. He walked through the burned doorway, looked at the shop, looked at the community standing around her, looked at Jolene sitting on the tile floor. He didn't say, "I'll fix it." He didn't say, "I'll take revenge." He didn't say anything. Because Wade Kincaid had lived long enough to know that there were moments when words only made the person hearing them feel more alone. He walked through the ashes, came to Jolene, and sat down beside her on the burned tile floor, shoulder touching shoulder, and stayed. Sometimes being beside someone is enough, and right then, in the ashes of marshes, among the faces standing around them, and the morning light pouring through the broken roof, it was enough. Jolene cried for 10 minutes. Then, she wiped her face with the back of her ash-stained hand, stood up, looked around at the wreckage, looked at the faces standing around her, and said, her voice still trembling but straight, "I need a new stove, a new oven, and someone to help me clear this place." Not the next day, not the next week, the same day. The same morning she had just cried on the burned tile floor, Jolene Marsh stood up, and that was the 3rd time in this story that she stood up. But this time no one pulled her up, no one placed a coat over her shoulders, no one said, "This alley isn't where you belong." This time, she stood on her own. The community came to help, and no one needed to be invited. They came because this was where they ate breakfast every day, where Bert sat in his familiar seat, where the coffee never cooled, and they didn't need anyone to explain why it mattered. Wade made one phone call, and that afternoon, the new stove arrived, bigger than the old one, and he didn't explain why it was bigger, and Jolene didn't ask. That evening, after everyone had gone home, when Marsh's was still in disorder but had begun to take shape again, Jolene sat down in the middle of the little place, half burned and half new, took a blank notebook from her bag, opened to the first page, picked up a pen, and began to write. Line by line, word by word, from memory, her grandmother's cinnamon pastry recipe. Page 1. Ingredients. Method. Oven temperature. Baking time. Her mother's peach pastry recipe. Page 2. Note. Add a little more cinnamon. Ginger porridge, which didn't need a recipe, but she wrote it down because it deserved to be written down. Her hand moved steadily, without hesitation, because her grandmother had made her read every night for 15 years, and she had put all of it inside Jolene's head, before paper ever had a chance to betray her. Her grandmother had known. She had always known. Jolene wrote until page 12, then stopped and looked at her own handwriting on the white paper. It wasn't her grandmother's handwriting, slanting slightly to the right. It wasn't her mother's handwriting, round and neat. This was her handwriting, straight, strong, the kind of handwriting that came from a person writing with her whole arm, not just her wrist. And she realized the new notebook wasn't less than the old one. It was different, but it wasn't less. This was the fourth generation. Her grandmother lived in her memory, not on the paper, and paper could burn, but memory couldn't, and her hands were still here, and tomorrow she would still bake, and Perry Whitmore could burn as many warehouses as he wanted, but he couldn't burn what 3 generations of women had carved into her bones. 3 weeks later, after days of non-stop rebuilding with the help of the community, Jolene Marsh put on the cleanest clothes she owned, the outfit she saved for occasions when she needed to look in the mirror and see someone ready, then walked straight to Perry Whitmore's main restaurant in South Beach. Alone, in broad daylight, through the front door, during the lunch hour, when the restaurant was at its busiest, when every table was occupied and every person had eyes. The hostess looked her up and down, the quick kind of look people who worked in 5-star restaurants had trained into reflex, the kind of look that sorted a guest before a word was spoken. Jolene knew what that hostess saw. A plus-size woman in plain clothes, the smell of vanilla clinging to her hands, looking nothing like anyone who usually walked through that door at Thursday lunch. The hostess was about to say the familiar sentence, the sentence Jolene had heard in different versions all her life. "I'm sorry, this place isn't suitable." But Jolene spoke first. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitmore. He knows who I am." The hostess hesitated, looked inside, and made an internal call. 1 minute later, she nodded and stepped aside. Perry Whitmore let her in because Perry thought she had come to beg for mercy. He thought the fire had done its work, and now the bakery girl would come crying, pleading, or at least admitting that he had won. Perry Whitmore was used to seeing people come after he had broken something, and they always came wearing the same face. Jolene walked through the restaurant, straight to the VIP table in the inner corner, where Perry sat alone with a white tablecloth, a glass of red wine, and an appetizer plate he hadn't touched. She stopped in front of the table, stood straight, and looked at him with eyes Perry had never seen on the face of anyone he had ever burned. Eyes without fear, without anger, without pleading, only truth. "You burned my shop," she said, her voice neither loud nor soft, just clear enough for the 3 tables around them to hear every word. "My grandmother's recipe book burned inside it. 3 generations of women wrote in that book. My grandmother's handwriting, my mother's notes, things you'll never understand, because no one has ever left you anything worth keeping." Perry smirked. The same smirk he used in every negotiation, the kind of smirk that said he was above and the person across from him was below, and that distance would never change. "Then you should have bought a fireproof safe," he said, taking a sip of wine. Jolene laughed, not a forced laugh, not a bitter laugh, a real laugh, the kind that came from someone who had passed through fear and discovered that on the other side there was nothing but clarity. "Do you know the beautiful thing about a family recipe, Mr. Whitmore? It doesn't live on paper. It lives in the hands of the person cooking." She lifted both hands, hands dusted with flour, calloused, hands that had kneaded dough from 4 o'clock in the morning every day for more years than she cared to count. "You burned paper, but my hands are still here, and tomorrow I'm still opening. No matter how many more times you burn it down, I'll still open, because I don't need paper to cook. I need these 2 hands and a stove, and you can't take either one." Perry stopped smirking. The glass of wine paused midway, neither lifted to his mouth nor set down. He looked at Jolene, and for the first time, he didn't see the girl who had been thrown into an alley, didn't see the little bakery at the harbor, didn't see the nuisance he had thought one fire would solve. He saw someone he didn't know how to deal with, because every tool he had, money, power, fire, none of it worked on a person who had lost everything and still stood straight. Jolene turned away. She walked out through the front door, the same door she had entered, through the restaurant, past the silent tables watching her, past the hostess, standing tucked to one side. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. Her steps were steady, her back straight, the smell of vanilla clinging to her hands as she walked out into the sun. The door closed behind her, and inside, Perry Whitmore sat alone at the VIP table, the glass of wine still held midway, the appetizer plate still untouched, and the smile he had carried all his life like a weapon had vanished from his face, and it didn't come back. Perry Whitmore didn't come himself the second time. He sent people. 3 days after Jolene walked out of his restaurant through the front door, 3 men walked into Marsh's through the front door at exactly the busiest hour, when every seat was filled, and Bert was drinking his second coffee in his familiar chair, and Jolene was handing out a tray of peach pastries fresh from the oven. The 3 men wore dark shirts and had broad shoulders. The kind of men hired not because they were smart, but because they were big. And the largest one in front walked straight to the counter, as if this place had belonged to someone else for a long time, and everyone inside simply didn't know it yet. "Business protection fee," he said, his voice flat as if he were reading an invoice. 20% of weekly revenue. Paid on Friday. The shop went silent. Jolene set the pastry tray down, lifted the cast iron skillet from its hook with one hand, held it firmly, naturally, as if she were holding a spoon. "I don't see a contract," she said. The man looked at the cast iron skillet, looked at Jolene, and decided she wasn't a concern. "Verbal agreement," he said. Jolene looked straight at him. "So is my answer." The man stepped up to the counter and placed his palm flat on the wood, the kind of gesture meant to say that whatever lay beneath my hand belongs to me. Jolene didn't move back. She picked up the tray of pastries fresh from the oven, hot, very hot, and set it directly onto the back of his hand. The man jerked his hand back by reflex, knocking the tray upward, and powdered sugar from the pastries flew into the air like a small white cloud, then settled over his face, white from forehead to chin, across his eyebrows, nose, and mouth, completely dusted. He stood there, his face covered in powdered sugar, his hand stinging, his eyes blinking, and the whole shop burst into laughter. The laughter broke open inside the fear, the kind of laughter from people who knew they were afraid, but couldn't help themselves, because the sight in front of them was funnier than the fear. The other two men rushed toward the counter, knocking over a chair on the way. Just then, the back door opened. Wade Kincaid stepped in. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply walked straight to the nearest man, grabbed him by the collar with one hand, lifted him off the ground, took 3 steps to the right, and set him down on the other side of the counter, gently, precisely, as if placing an object that had been left in the wrong place back where it belonged. The man dropped to the floor, his eyes wide, not understanding what had just happened. The third man looked at his coworker on the floor, looked at Wade, and ran. The front door slammed shut behind him. The man with the powdered sugar on his face stood up, tried uselessly to brush himself off, looked at Jolene, looked at Wade, and said, "This isn't over." Jolene had already turned back to the kitchen, her back to him, her voice calm. "Close the door for me on your way out. I just mopped the floor." Bert, in his familiar chair, burst out laughing. It was a full, rich, ringing laugh in the little shop. The first laugh anyone there had ever heard from him. The laugh of a man who had forgotten he knew how to laugh and had just remembered. The whole shop laughed with him, one by one, like streetlights being switched on one at a time in the dark. The 3 men left. The door closed. The laughter slowly faded, and in its place came something heavier, something deeper. Jolene stood behind the counter, and she saw the entire shop looking at her, not with curiosity, not with pity, not with fear. They looked at her with a kind of gaze she wasn't used to receiving, something close to recognition, close to gratitude, close to something she didn't have a word for but could feel against her skin. Trina stood up, the girl who had worked as a bartender for Perry Whitmore for 5 years, the girl who sat on the outer bench every morning, though Jolene had never asked why she was here instead of back in her old place. Trina stood in the middle of the shop, holding a small, hard-covered notebook, and said, her voice trembling slightly but clear, "I worked for Whitmore for 5 years. I kept a notebook of every transaction he made, every protection fee, every forced contract, every threat. I wrote it all down." She placed the notebook on the counter, her hand still shaking. "I stayed quiet because I thought no one would listen." The shop went silent. Then the carpenter on the outer bench stood up, and he spoke, briefly, about the unfair contract he had been forced to sign. Then the laundromat owner, and she told them about the times she had been threatened. No chaos, no shouting, just one person after another standing and speaking in turn, in the voices of people who had just discovered that they weren't alone, that silence wasn't the only choice, that someone had opened a door and all they had to do was step through. Wade stood beside the back door, not blocking it, only present, with the kind of presence he always carried, heavy and quiet. He took out his phone, sent messages, made calls, activated the network behind him, the way he always operated, only with a different purpose. This time, not to destroy. This time, to build. Trina looked at Wade, then turned to Jolene and said softly, just loud enough for the 2 of them to hear, "Do you know what he's doing to make this happen?" Jolene looked at Wade by the back door, looked at Trina's notebook on the counter, looked at the faces that had just stood up. "I know who he is," she said. "I also know who he's becoming." Jolene placed both hands flat on the counter she had built twice. In the kitchen she had built twice. Inside the building she had built twice. And she looked at the whole shop, at the familiar faces, at the faces that had just opened their mouths for the first time in years. And she said, "Tomorrow, same time." It was the sentence she always said, the sentence she had said to Bert that first morning, the sentence she said every night when she closed. But tonight it carried a different meaning, and everyone in the shop understood. Wade chose a coffee shop in downtown Miami, in the middle of the day, crowded with people, sunlight pouring through the large glass windows. He sat alone at a table near the window, with no one beside him, no men, no weapons, only a cup of coffee and a white envelope placed face down on the table. He chose this place deliberately, because this meeting didn't belong to the darkness, didn't belong to the harbor, or some conference room on a high floor. This meeting belonged to daylight, where everything was clear and no one could say they hadn't seen. Ronan came. He stepped into the coffee shop, looked around, saw Wade, and sat down across from him. Ronan's face was tight, his eyes sweeping quickly over the entrances, the back door, the customers seated around them, searching for what he was certain had to be there. An ambush, a trap, the ending he had been imagining ever since he received the call asking him to meet. He found nothing. Only Wade, coffee, and the white envelope. "I know everything," Wade said, his voice flat, not angry, not sad, just flat, like water without a ripple when there is no wind. "The New York gang, the harbor, my bodyguard you bought, the fire at the shop. I've known since the second day." Ronan looked at him. "The second day," he repeated, and in those words was the whole question he didn't dare ask fully. If Wade had known since the second day, why was Ronan still breathing? "Then why am I still sitting here?" Ronan asked, his voice low. Wade looked at him, looked at the face he had seen for 8 years, the face that had been on his right side in every meeting, every decision, every late night when he needed someone to stand guard at the door and not ask why. He pushed the white envelope across the table. Ronan looked down, but didn't open it. "A one-way plane ticket," Wade said, "and enough money to start over anywhere that isn't Miami." Ronan looked at the envelope, then looked at Wade. "Is this forgiveness?" "This is 8 years," Wade said, "and this is the last time." The silence between them lasted just long enough for the coffee to cool by 1 more degree. Ronan looked into Wade's eyes, searching for what he had been used to seeing there for 8 years. The coldness, the calculation, the readiness to do whatever had to be done. He didn't find it. He found something else. Something he didn't have a word for. Close to release. Close to the decision of a man who had chosen not to become what everyone thought he had to become. Ronan took the envelope, stood up, and walked out the door. He didn't look back. He didn't know that Wade had already sent word through the underworld before this meeting ever happened. Ronan sold information to the New York gang. Ronan sold out his boss. In their world, that information was a sentence. No one would work with a man who sold out his boss. No one would trust him. No one would open a door. The plane ticket wasn't mercy. It was exile. And exile was how Wade Kincaid dealt with a traitor without needing to become his father. Wade stayed seated alone, took a sip of coffee, and looked out through the glass. Miami afternoon sunlight, gold and hot. He looked down at his empty wrist and turned it slightly, feeling the weight that was no longer there. Light. His wrist was light, and that lightness wasn't emptiness. It was space. It was room for something new, something he didn't yet know how to name, but had already begun to feel from the night he sat inside a bakery eating ginger porridge at 3 o'clock in the morning. Saturday morning. 2 police cars parked in front of the main restaurant of Whitmore & Co. Red and blue lights turning on their roofs, reflecting across the glass doors Perry Whitmore still had polished every day. 2 uniformed officers walked in, and Perry Whitmore walked out with his hands cuffed behind his back, silent. The evidence. Trina's notebook, the testimony of the community, and the files Wade's network had gathered and delivered to the right place at the right time. Perry left without saying a word, without looking at anyone, without turning back to look one last time at the restaurant that carried his name. Silence. And that silence was more complete than any cheering or applause, because it was the sound of a city finally breathing out. At the same time, 3 streets away, Jolene Marsh was opening Marsh's. She saw the red and blue lights flashing far down the street, saw the 2 police cars, and she knew. She didn't run over to watch. She didn't call anyone. She turned back into the kitchen, lit the stove, took out the dough, and baked the first batch of cinnamon pastries of the day, because that was how Jolene Marsh answered everything life threw at her, with the stove, with dough, with her hands, and with a door that always stayed open. Sunday, no one had made an appointment. No one had organized anything. People simply came. Bert arrived first, as he did every morning, standing in front of the door before Jolene opened it, his knit cap on his head, his arms folded across his chest. Then Trina, then the carpenter, then the laundromat owner, then the faces Jolene had grown so used to that she could recognize each person by the sound of their footsteps before she even saw their face. Someone brought a guitar, placed it in the corner of the shop, and softly strummed chords that didn't belong to any particular song, just sound filling the air. Someone brought wildflowers in an old porcelain vase and set them on the counter, the small yellow petals leaning toward the window where sunlight poured in. Lights hung in front of the door, though no one knew who had hung them, glowing warmly above the Marshes' sign that Wade had hired someone to paint again for the second time. Marshes stayed open all day. Jolene cooked from morning until afternoon. Cinnamon pastries, peach pastries, biscuits, tray after tray, batch after batch, because people kept coming and she kept making food, because that was who she was, because that was how she existed in the world, and how she gave away the one thing no one could ever return. Her hands kneaded dough, cut dough, set trays down, pulled trays out, and sweat beaded across her forehead beneath the kitchen light, and she didn't stop, because stopping wasn't Jolene Marsh. Wade sat at his usual table, in his usual chair, a cup of coffee in front of him, powdered sugar from the pastries whitening the sleeve of his black suit jacket, the same sugar he had stopped brushing away a long time ago. He sat in the right corner, where he always sat, but today he wasn't watching the door. He was watching the shop, watching the smiling faces, watching the guitar in the corner, watching the wildflowers on the counter, watching Bert in his familiar chair talking with Trina, and he looked at all of it with the same attention he had once reserved only for danger, with eyes that had always swept a room for exits and enemies, and it turned out those eyes were suited to joy too. They could see laughter and sunlight, and the scent of pastries too. He just hadn't ever tried before. Then Bert stood up. He walked behind the counter, where he had kept an old box that no one had asked about. He opened the box and took out a trumpet. The brass was tarnished, the valves were a little stiff, and there was a small dent in the bell. It was the trumpet he hadn't touched in 20 years. Not since the jazz club closed. Not since he lost his direction. Not since he forgot who he had once been before the smell of pastries at 4 o'clock in the morning reminded him. He lifted the trumpet to his lips. His fingers settled on the valves, stiff, slow, no longer as nimble as they had been 20 years earlier. He blew the first note. The breath was short. The note trembled, not yet full. He blew the second note, a little better. Then the third, missed, half a tone off, and he winced. But he didn't stop. He played. The melody was slow, broken in places, imperfect. But he played, and the sound of the trumpet rose inside the little shop filled with the smell of pastries, weaving through the guitar in the corner, and that was the moment when everything came together. Not only Jolene restored, not only Marshes rebuilt, but Bert too, and Trina too, and the carpenter, and the laundromat owner, and all the people who had stayed silent for too long, and were sitting here today in a bakery at the harbor, listening to an old man play trumpet after 20 years. And no one needed to say this was a miracle, because no one here believed in miracles. They believed in cinnamon pastries at 4 o'clock in the morning, and coffee that never cooled, and a woman who said, "Tomorrow, the same time." Wade listened to the trumpet and looked down at his empty wrist. No watch anymore. No weight reminding him. He didn't need it anymore, because he knew who he was now, not by what he wore on his wrist, but by what he chose to do when no one was watching, by the way he stacked chairs in an empty shop, by the way he sat on a burned tile floor beside a woman who was crying, by the white envelope on the coffee shop table, and the way he said, "This is the last time," instead of doing what his father would have done. Bert lowered the trumpet, his eyes wet, but he was smiling, and he lifted his coffee cup. To the greatest woman in South Beach. The whole shop lifted cups, glasses, pastries, whatever anyone had in their hands, and the response rose through the little place, not loud, not noisy, but united, the kind of sound that only happens when everyone in a room feels the same thing and says it together in the same breath. Jolene stood behind the counter. She stood straight. She didn't look away. She didn't lower her head. She didn't pretend to be humble in that way people often do when they're praised, because they fear accepting praise will be mistaken for arrogance. She accepted it, because she deserved it, and she knew she deserved it. And today she allowed herself to know that. She looked at Wade. He lifted his coffee cup once, lightly, without saying anything, like a man raising a glass when words would only lessen the meaning of the moment. She gave a small nod, just enough for him to see, then turned back to the kitchen, opened the oven, pulled out a tray, and baked one more tray of peach pastries, because the night was still long, and people were still hungry, and Jolene Marsh had never left a table empty. Sometimes true power isn't making people afraid. It's making people brave enough to speak. A person's worth doesn't live in appearance, doesn't live in fear, but in what you build, what you give, and how you stand up each time you're pushed down. Jolene was thrown into an alley with empty hands and a soaked notebook. She stood up, built a kitchen, fed an entire neighborhood, lost everything, then built it again. Not because she didn't know pain, but because she knew cooking was the one thing no one could take away. Wade entered this story as the man everyone feared. He left it as someone another person wanted to sit beside, not because of power, but because he had learned how to use strength for what was right. And Bert, the man who had forgotten who he used to be, smelled the pastries, remembered, sat down, ate, and 20 years later, lifted his trumpet and played again. Sometimes all a person needs is a seat, a meal, and someone saying, "Tomorrow, same time. Thank you for staying until the end of the story." How did this story make you feel? Please share what you feel from deep in your heart in the comment section below. We're always listening, and we truly value every word you write. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories, because every story is worth staying for. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.